After 43 years, they gave her nothing, except a key that led to a life she never knew existed. The church emptied before she realized no one had said her name. Margaret stood alone on the steps, the cold air sharper than she remembered, a small envelope in her hand. Inside was a worn brass key. No note, no explanation, just something heavy enough to matter. And somewhere beyond the quiet roads and forgotten towns, it was waiting to open a door she was never meant to find. If you were in her place, would you let it go, or would you follow where that key leads? The church smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish, the kind that never quite covered the damp underneath. Margaret Ellison paused just inside the doorway, one gloved hand resting against the frame, as if she needed a moment to remember why she had come. Outside, the October air had been sharp and clean. Inside, everything felt close, stale, heavy with something that had already settled before she arrived. The service had started without her. No one had noticed. She moved quietly down the aisle, her shoes making a soft, hollow sound against the worn floorboards. Heads were turned forward, shoulders pressed together in neat rows. People who had known Leonard for years. Men in dark suits, women with carefully pinned hair and folded programs resting in their laps. No one turned, not even when she passed. Margaret found a seat near the back, not the last row, but close enough to feel like she didn't belong any closer. She sat down slowly, smoothing her coat beneath her as if she were visiting, not attending her own husband's funeral. At the front of the church, a large framed photograph of Leonard stood on an easel beside the pulpit. Margaret stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the one she would have chosen. He looked younger in it, maybe by 10 years, his hair darker, his smile fixed in that polite way he used with clients. It wasn't how he had looked in the mornings, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold. It wasn't how he had looked the last year, when his hands had begun to shake slightly when he reached for things. It wasn't how she remembered him at all. The minister was speaking, a man of integrity, a builder not only of homes, but of trust. Margaret listened, or tried to. The words drifted past her, familiar phrases arranged neatly, the kind of things people said when someone died. She had heard them before, many times. But something about this felt off. She shifted slightly in her seat and glanced around the room. There were people missing. She couldn't name all of them right away, but she felt the absence like a gap in a sentence. No one from the old job sites Leonard used to talk about. None of the men who had come by the house in the early years, boots muddy, voices loud. Even Harold Jenkins, who had known Leonard since before Margaret ever met him. He wasn't there. Margaret frowned faintly. That didn't make sense. A soft rustle drew her attention to the front row. Her stepdaughter, Elaine, sat stiffly beside her brother, her posture perfect, hands folded too tightly in her lap. She hadn't looked back once. Not when Margaret entered. Not even now. Margaret watched her for a moment, waiting without fully realizing she was waiting. Elaine adjusted the sleeve of her coat, leaned slightly toward her brother as he whispered something, but she didn't turn, not even by accident. Margaret lowered her gaze. The program in her hands felt thin, too thin. She flipped it open quietly. Leonard Ellison. Beloved father, grandfather, and friend. Margaret's eyes moved over the words. They didn't stop. There was no mention of a wife. Not even a line. She closed the program carefully, pressing the edges together until they aligned. The minister stepped aside. A man Margaret didn't recognize approached the pulpit. Tall, confident. He spoke clearly, like someone used to being heard. Leonard was the kind of man you could rely on. Margaret listened again, tried to follow. Stories were told, projects completed, favors done, a lifetime measured in work and reputation. People nodded. Some smiled softly. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes. Margaret waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for anymore. Maybe just something that sounded like the life she had lived. But it didn't come. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Still. Controlled. The way they had learned to be over the years. A faint draft moved through the church, brushing against the back of her neck. She pulled her coat a little tighter. The service continued. Voices rose and fell. Shoes shifted. Someone coughed. Time passed, though it didn't feel like it was moving. And then slowly, without warning, Margaret felt something inside her loosen. It wasn't grief. That was what surprised her. She had expected grief, prepared for it, the heavy kind that pressed on your chest and made breathing difficult. But what came instead was lighter. Not happiness, not anything she could name easily, just a quiet easing, like a room that had been too tight, suddenly had space in it again. Margaret's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her skirt. She stared at the floor. The thought came, uninvited. And once it came, it didn't leave. I can breathe. Her chest rose slowly, fell. No one around her noticed. No one looked. At the front of the church, Leonard's photograph stood unchanged, smiling that same distant smile. Margaret swallowed. A flicker of unease followed close behind the feeling, sharp, quick, because she didn't understand it. Didn't understand what kind of woman sat at her husband's funeral and felt something like relief. She kept her face still. That part came easily. The service ended with a hymn she barely recognized. Voices joined together, uneven, uncertain. Margaret didn't sing. She stood when the others stood, sat when they sat, moved when they moved. And when it was over, people began to gather near the front. Conversations started softly, then grew. Margaret remained in her seat for a moment longer. No one came to her. No one asked if she needed anything. She rose finally, smoothing her coat again, and walked slowly down the aisle. Up close, the photograph looked even less like him. Margaret paused beside it, for just a second. Then she kept walking. Outside, the air hit her face, cold, clean, real. She stepped down onto the cracked pavement and stood there, unsure of what came next. Behind her, the doors opened and closed. Voices carried, laughter even. Margaret didn't turn around. She stood very still. And that quiet, unfamiliar space inside her stayed. Not growing, not fading, just there, waiting for her to understand it. Margaret stood on the church steps longer than she meant to. Cars pulled away one by one, tires crunching over loose gravel. Doors slammed, voices drifted and faded. Someone laughed too loudly, then quickly softened it, as if remembering where they were. She didn't move until the parking lot was nearly empty. No one approached her. No one asked where she was going next. That, more than anything, settled something quietly inside her. The will reading was scheduled for 3 days later. A law office downtown, the kind with tinted windows and a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. Margaret arrived early. She always did. Old habits, things Leonard used to expect. She sat in a chair near the wall, her purse resting neatly in her lap, hands folded over it. Across the room, a receptionist typed steadily, not looking up. Margaret noticed the small things. The clock on the wall was 5 minutes fast. The stack of magazines hadn't been touched in weeks, corners curling slightly. A coat rack stood in the corner, empty. She wondered briefly if anyone else would come early. They didn't. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door to the conference room opened. Mrs. Ellison? Margaret stood. The man who greeted her was younger than she expected. Mid-40s, maybe. Neatly dressed. Polite but not warm. Please come in. She followed him. Inside, the room was already occupied. Elaine sat at the far side of the table, her back straight, hands clasped. Her brother, Daniel, leaned slightly forward, scrolling through something on his phone. He didn't look up. Neither of them acknowledged Margaret when she entered. There were 2 other men in suits seated beside Daniel. Lawyers, she assumed. Their folders were already open. Margaret took the only empty chair left. At the end of the table, she set her purse down gently and folded her hands again. The younger attorney cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We'll begin. Papers shifted. A pen clicked softly. Margaret watched his hands as he arranged the documents in front of him. He avoided looking directly at her. She noticed that. He began reading. Formal language first. Legal phrasing. Words that stretched on longer than necessary. Margaret followed as best she could, but her attention drifted to the details around him instead. The slight tremor in his left hand. The way he paused, just once before turning a page. The silence from Elaine. Daniel's phone screen going dark as he finally set it aside. Then the tone changed. Regarding the primary residence, Margaret's focus sharpened. The property located at 18 Wilton Street shall be transferred in full ownership to Mr. Daniel Cross. She didn't react, didn't move. She simply listened. The business holdings associated with Ellison Contracting are likewise assigned. Assigned. Not shared. Not divided. Assigned. Margaret kept her eyes on the table. The wood grain ran in long, uneven lines. One of them had a small split near the edge. She traced it with her gaze. Financial accounts, including savings and retirement assets, are to be distributed between Mr. Cross and Miss Elaine Harper. Still no mention of her name. Margaret inhaled slowly. The room felt smaller now, or maybe quieter. She wasn't sure, with the exception of a personal item designated specifically for Mrs. Margaret Ellison. That made her look up. Just slightly. The attorney reached for a smaller envelope set apart from the rest of the papers. It looked out of place. Plain, unmarked. He hesitated, just for a second, before sliding it across the table. It stopped a few inches in front of her. No one else moved. Margaret reached for it. Her fingers brushed the paper. It felt thicker than it looked, rough along the edges. She opened it carefully. Inside there was only one thing. A key. Brass, old, worn smooth at the edges, as if it had been used for many years. The bow was simple, slightly bent on one side. No tag, no label. Margaret turned it over in her hand. There was no note, no explanation. Nothing. She looked back at the attorney. "That's all?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret studied his face. He still wasn't looking at her directly. She lowered her gaze to the papers spread across the table. Something didn't sit right. Not the decision itself. That part, she realized, she had already accepted without quite knowing she had. It was the details. The dates. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to see the top page more clearly. The will had been signed 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. Margaret's mind moved quickly, pulling at memory. 6 weeks ago, Leonard had struggled to button his own coat. 6 weeks ago, he had asked her twice what day it was. 6 weeks ago, she blinked. The signature at the bottom of the page looked like his, but not quite. The letters were tighter, less steady. Rushed. Margaret sat back again. Her fingers closed around the key in her lap. Daniel finally spoke. "We'll need the house cleared out within 2 weeks," he said, not looking at her. "That gives you enough time." Enough time. Margaret turned her head slowly, studied him. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just more certain, as if everything had already been decided long before today. Elaine adjusted her sleeve again, still avoiding Margaret's eyes. The attorney continued speaking, outlining procedures, next steps, formalities. Margaret listened, but not to him. She listened to the silence between the words, to the way no one questioned anything, to the way it all felt prepared. She slipped the key back into the envelope, folded the flap down, and placed it inside her purse. Carefully, as if it mattered. When the meeting ended, chairs shifted, papers were gathered, conversations began, quiet, efficient, already moving forward. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer. No one spoke to her. No one asked if she needed help. She stood on her own, picked up her purse, and walked out of the room without looking back. Outside, the sky was overcast, the kind that made everything look flatter than it was. Margaret paused on the sidewalk. Cars passed. People moved around her. Life continuing. She opened her purse again, took out the envelope, and slid the key into her palm. It felt heavier now, colder. She turned it once between her fingers. There was something about it. Not just that it existed, but that it was all she had been given. Margaret closed her hand around it. Tight. And for the first time since the church, that quiet space inside her shifted. Not gone, just disturbed. Because now, alongside it, something else had begun to form. A question. And it didn't feel like one she could ignore. Margaret stood on the sidewalk a moment longer, the envelope still open in her hand, the key resting in her palm like something unfinished. Cars passed. Someone brushed by her shoulder without noticing. A man laughed into his phone as he walked past, his voice too loud for the gray afternoon. Margaret closed her fingers around the key, then she slipped it back into her purse and began to walk. The house felt different when she returned. Not empty. Not yet. But distant. As if it had already decided she didn't belong there anymore. Margaret stood just inside the front door, her hand still resting on the knob behind her. The familiar scent of the place, wood polish, old fabric, something faintly metallic from the kitchen, seemed thinner now. She listened. No television, no footsteps, no quiet movements from another room, just the soft hum of the refrigerator. She stepped inside and closed the door. The sound echoed more than it should have. She didn't start packing right away. Instead, she walked through the house slowly, room by room. The living room first. The sofa where Leonard used to sit, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The small table beside it, still holding a coaster with a faint ring from an old coffee cup. The hallway. The bedroom. She paused at the doorway. For a long moment, she didn't step in. Then she did. The bed was neatly made, exactly as she had left it the morning of the funeral. His side still slightly indented in a way that hadn't quite faded yet. Margaret moved to the dresser, opened the top drawer. Socks, folded, ordered. Nothing unusual. She closed it again, but her eyes lingered. Something about the room felt incomplete. Not wrong, just missing. Margaret turned slowly, scanning the surfaces, the nightstand, the lamp, the small stack of books Leonard had never finished reading. Then she saw it. The desk in the corner. She hadn't thought much about it before. It had always been his space. Papers, tools, small items she didn't touch. Now the top of it looked too clean. Margaret walked toward it. Her fingers brushed the surface. No dust, no scattered papers. The drawer was slightly open. She pulled it. Empty. She froze. That wasn't right. Leonard kept things there. She knew he did. Not because she looked, she hadn't, but because she had seen him use it. Late at night. Quietly. Closing it when she entered the room. Margaret opened the second drawer. Also empty. Her breath slowed. She checked the third. Nothing. Not even a loose receipt. Margaret stood there, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. Someone had cleared it. Recently. The next morning, Daniel arrived at exactly 8. Margaret heard his car before she saw him. The low engine, the door shutting with a firm, practiced motion. She was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He didn't knock. The door opened, and he stepped inside like he belonged there. "We should start going through things," he said, glancing around briefly. 2 weeks isn't long." Margaret turned to face him. He was dressed neatly, not formal but deliberate, like someone arriving to handle a task. "You've been here," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel paused. Just for a second, then shrugged lightly. "I stopped by yesterday, needed to check a few things." Margaret watched him, her eyes steady. "The desk," she said. He followed her gaze toward the hallway. "It was cleared," she added. Daniel's expression didn't change much. "Probably just old paperwork," he said. "Nothing important." Margaret didn't respond. She turned back to her coffee, lifted it, took a small sip. It had gone cold. Packing began that afternoon, slowly. Margaret moved through the house with boxes she found in the garage, folding, wrapping, placing things carefully inside. Clothes first, then dishes, photographs. She paused over those longer than she meant to. Some of them she recognized immediately. Others felt distant. Moments she remembered being present for, but not fully part of. She set those aside. Late that evening, as the light outside faded into a dull blue, Margaret opened an old cookbook she hadn't touched in years. It had belonged to her mother. The pages were worn, edges softened from use. She flipped through it slowly, not looking for anything in particular, just moving. Then something slipped free, a small piece of paper. It fell onto the counter. Margaret stared at it, then bent down and picked it up. A receipt. Faded. The ink barely visible. She turned it toward the light. Gas station. The name printed across the top. Ashvale Ridge. Margaret frowned. She didn't recognize it. The date was older. Years ago. But not too old. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. No note. No explanation. Just the place. That night, Margaret lay in bed at the motel. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older underneath it. The walls were thin. She could hear a television from the next room, voices rising and falling in uneven bursts. She stared at the ceiling. The receipt lay on the nightstand beside her. The key rested on top of it. She reached over, picked up the receipt again. Ashvale Ridge. The name repeated in her mind. She tried to place it, tried to connect it to something. A conversation. A memory. A passing comment. Nothing came. But something else did. A feeling. The same one from earlier. That quiet sense that something had been happening just out of sight. For a long time. Margaret turned onto her side, closed her eyes, and saw Leonard standing by the door one evening years ago, keys in hand, saying he had a job to check. She had nodded. Of course she had. She always had. Margaret opened her eyes again, looked at the key, then at the receipt. Her fingers moved slowly, aligning them side by side. The question returned, stronger now, and this time, it carried something else with it. Direction. Margaret exhaled softly, and for the first time since the reading of the will, she didn't feel like waiting. She felt like following. Margaret sat at the small round table in the motel room, the receipt spread flat beneath her hand. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Outside, a car engine started, then faded into the distance. Ashvale Ridge. She said the name quietly, just once, as if hearing it aloud might make it more familiar. It didn't. But it stayed. The next morning, Margaret returned to the house before Daniel arrived. She moved with purpose now. Not fast, not frantic, but deliberate. The way she used to move when something needed to be done right the first time. She went straight to the hallway closet where she kept old files. Tax returns, insurance papers, utility records, boxes labeled in her own careful handwriting. She pulled one down, set it on the dining table, opened it. Paper rustled as she began sorting. Year by year. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for yet, but she trusted the feeling that something would show itself. It took time, longer than she expected. The morning light shifted slowly across the table as she worked, page by page, her fingers tracing dates, addresses, small printed lines most people never noticed. Then she found it. A bank statement. 8 years old. A withdrawal, The amount wasn't large enough to stand out. But the location was. Ashvale Ridge. Margaret stared at it, then reached for another file. Another year. Another statement. There it was again. Not every month, but often enough. Always the same place. Always in cash. Her pulse slowed. Steadier now. She pulled out 3 more statements, laying them side by side. Dates, amounts, locations, a pattern, not obvious at first glance, but clear once you looked long enough. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her mind moving quietly, fitting pieces together. Leonard hadn't just gone there once. He had gone there regularly. For years. The front door opened. Margaret didn't look up right away. She heard Daniel step inside, his footsteps firm against the floor. "You're here early," he said. Margaret kept her eyes on the papers. "Yes." He moved closer, stopping near the table. "What are you doing?" She lifted one of the statements. "Organizing," she said. Daniel glanced at the papers, then away. "Make sure you don't mix anything up," he said. "Some of those might still be needed." Margaret looked at him then, her expression calm. "I won't." He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, then nodded once and turned away. Margaret watched him go, then returned to the table. Her hand rested lightly over the statements. He knew something. Not everything, but enough to make him careful. By noon, Margaret had packed a small bag. Not much. A change of clothes. Her purse. The envelope with the key. And the receipt. She stood in the doorway of the house for a moment before leaving. Looking back. Not at the furniture, not at the walls, but at the space itself. 43 years. Reduced now to something she could carry in the trunk of her car. She stepped outside, closed the door, and didn't lock it. The drive took longer than she expected. Ashvale Ridge wasn't marked clearly on the main roads. She followed signs that pointed toward smaller towns, then smaller roads, until the highway narrowed into something quieter. The sky opened up. Fields stretched on either side, dry and pale under the autumn light. Fewer houses, more distance between them. Margaret drove with both hands on the wheel, her posture straight, eyes steady. She didn't turn on the radio, didn't need the distraction. The name guided her. Ashvale Ridge. It felt closer now. Not familiar. But waiting. She passed a gas station first. Small, older, the kind with handwritten signs in the window and a bell that rang when the door opened. Margaret slowed, then turned in. The tires crunched over gravel. She parked near the front, sat for a moment, then reached for the receipt, checked it again. Same name, same place. She stepped out of the car. The air was cooler here, quieter. When she pushed open the door, the bell rang softly. A man stood behind the counter, late 60s, maybe older, thin, wearing a worn flannel shirt. He looked up. Not surprised, just aware. Margaret approached slowly. She placed the receipt on the counter. "I'm looking for this place," she said. The man glanced down at it, then back at her. His eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "You found it," he said. Margaret didn't smile. "I'm looking for where it leads." The man nodded slightly. As if that made sense, he wiped his hands on a cloth, then leaned forward. "There's a road about a mile down," he said. "Gravel. Easy to miss if you're not paying attention." Margaret listened carefully. "Where does it go?" The man paused, just briefly, then said, "Far enough." Margaret held his gaze. Something passed between them. Not quite recognition, but close. "Did you know Leonard Ellison?" she asked. The man didn't answer right away. He looked past her, out the window, then back again. "I've seen him," he said. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly on the counter. When? Over the years. He didn't elaborate. Margaret didn't push. Not yet. She picked up the receipt, folded it once, placed it back in her purse. Thank you, she said. The man nodded. But as she turned to leave, he added quietly, roads easy to miss. Margaret paused, then continued out the door. Back in the car, she sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the wheel. The silence felt different here. Not empty. Watchful. Margaret started the engine, pulled back onto the road. Drove slowly now. Watching. Waiting. And then she saw it. A narrow gravel path, half hidden between two overgrown trees. No sign. No marker. Easy to miss. She slowed, turned the wheel, and drove in. The gravel shifted beneath her tires with a dry, uneven crunch. Margaret eased her foot off the gas. The road narrowed almost immediately. Trees leaned in from both sides, their branches stretching overhead like something closing. The light dimmed. What had been open sky just moments ago was now broken into thin strips between leaves and limbs. She drove slowly. Carefully. The path wasn't maintained. Patches of dirt showed through the gravel. Roots pressed up from beneath the surface, creating small ridges the car rolled over one at a time. No houses, no mailboxes, no signs, just the road. Margaret's hands stayed steady on the wheel. Her eyes moved constantly. Left, right, ahead. Watching. Measuring. The silence here was different from the house. Not hollow. Not empty. It felt held, like the air itself was paying attention. After a while, she couldn't tell how long, the road curved slightly, and then it opened. Margaret slowed the car to a stop without meaning to. Just ahead, set back from the edge of the clearing, stood a house. Not large, but not small either. Weathered wood siding faded to a soft gray. A narrow porch stretched across the front, its railing worn smooth in places. The roof dipped slightly in one corner, but it held. Tall pines stood behind it, shielding it from view. If you didn't know where to look, you wouldn't find it. Margaret didn't move right away. She sat in the car, engine still running. Looking. The house didn't feel abandoned. That was the first thing she noticed. There were no broken windows, no sagging doors, no signs of decay that came with time left alone too long. It stood quietly, intact, waiting. She turned off the engine. The sudden silence settled around her like something physical. Margaret reached for her purse, opened it, took out the envelope, then the key. It looked smaller now, somehow, simpler, but heavier in her hand. She stepped out of the car. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, cooler than the road she had just left. Still. Her shoes pressed lightly into the soft ground as she walked toward the house. Each step measured, each breath steady. The porch creaked under her weight when she stepped onto it. The sound echoed softly. Margaret paused at the door. Up close, she could see the details. The wood was worn but cared for. The hinges showed no rust. The handle was clean, used. Recently. Her fingers tightened slightly around the key. She looked at the lock. Simple. Old. waiting. For a moment, she didn't move. A thought passed through her, quiet but clear. You can still turn back. Margaret stood there, the key resting in her hand, the house in front of her, the road behind her. Then she lifted her hand and inserted the key. It slid in easily. No resistance. She turned it. A soft click. Clean. Not forced. Margaret exhaled slowly, then reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The air inside was cool. Still, but not stale. Margaret stepped in carefully. The floorboards beneath her feet were solid. No hollow sound. No give. The room opened into a small living area. Simple furniture. A worn sofa. A wooden table. 2 chairs. Nothing covered in dust. Nothing out of place. Margaret closed the door behind her. The sound settled into the space quietly. She stood still, listening. There was no movement, no sound from another room, just the faint creak of the house adjusting. She walked forward slowly. Her fingers brushed the back of a chair. The wood was smooth, not unused, maintained. Margaret turned slightly, scanning the room. There were items here she didn't expect. A coat hanging on a hook near the door, a pair of boots placed neatly beneath it, a folded blanket draped over the arm of the sofa. Details. Small things. But they mattered. Because they told her something simple. Someone had been here. Not long ago. Margaret moved toward the table. There was a small stack of papers resting on it. Not organized, not scattered either. Just left. She didn't touch them yet. Instead, she looked around again, taking in the space. The windows were clean. Light filtered through them in soft lines across the floor. A faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. Familiar, but she couldn't place where from. She stepped into the next room. A kitchen. Small, functional. The sink was empty. Dry. A dish towel hung neatly from the edge of the counter. Margaret opened a cabinet. Plates stacked. Clean. She closed it. Opened another. Cups. 2 of them. Set side by side. Her hand hovered for a moment before she pulled it back. Margaret returned to the main room. Her eyes moved again, slower now, more focused, looking not just at what was there, but how it was there. Everything had a place. Everything had been used, and then left. Not abandoned, not forgotten. Just paused. She finally reached for the papers on the table. Lifted the top one carefully. Her eyes scanned the page, then narrowed slightly. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Just a list. Supplies, materials, dates. Her fingers shifted to the next page. More of the same. Records. Careful. Detailed. Her breath slowed. This wasn't random. This was kept, maintained, tracked. Margaret set the papers back down exactly where she found them. Her gaze drifted toward the far wall. There was a door there, closed, plain. No markings. She didn't move toward it, not yet. Instead, she turned slowly in place, taking in the room again. But this time, it felt different. Not unfamiliar. Not entirely. There was something beneath it. Something she couldn't name, but couldn't ignore either. Margaret stepped back slightly. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. The key was still there. Warm now. From her hand. She closed her fingers around it. Tight. And for the first time since she had arrived, the question changed. Not what is this, but how long has this been here? Margaret stood in the center of the room, the question settling into her chest like something heavier than curiosity. It wasn't just about the house. It was about time. Years, maybe decades. And somehow, she had never known. She moved again, slower now, more careful. Her eyes weren't just seeing anymore. They were searching. Patterns, connections, proof. She went back to the table and picked up the top sheet again. The handwriting was Leonard's. That much she knew immediately. Not from how it looked, but from how it moved. The slight slant to the right, the way certain letters looped tighter than others, the pressure, firm, consistent. She had seen it for 43 years. Notes left on the counter, lists, small reminders. Only this was different, more detailed, more precise. Lumber, south wall repair, October 12th, roof patch, east corner, November 3rd, oil delivery, winter reserve. Margaret's fingers traced the dates. They stretched back. Years. Not recent. Not sudden. This had been going on, quietly, for a very long time. She sat down slowly at the table. The chair creaked beneath her, but held. She pulled the stack closer, turned the pages. More entries. More records. Everything tracked. Not like a business. Not exactly. More like care. Maintenance. As if someone had been keeping this place alive. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the bank statements she had taken earlier. She placed them beside the papers from the table. Her eyes moved between them. Back and forth. Comparing. Matching. There. The withdrawal from 8 years ago. She scanned the dates on the handwritten page. Found it. Same week. Another. 12 years ago. There again. Margaret leaned back slightly. The pattern wasn't loose anymore. It was exact. Leonard hadn't just come here. He had maintained this place regularly, planned it, tracked it, protected it. She stood again. The room felt smaller now, not because of its size, but because of what it contained. A life, one she had never been part of. Margaret walked toward the coat by the door. She lifted it slightly from the hook. Heavy, worn at the cuffs. Familiar. Not because she had seen it, but because it felt like something Leonard would wear. Out here. Not in town. Not at home. Somewhere else. She let it fall back into place. Her eyes shifted to the boots beneath it. Mud still faintly dried along the soles. Not fresh, but not old enough to forget. Someone had worn them. Recently. Margaret felt a quiet tension move through her chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just awareness. This place wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. It had been used. She turned toward the hallway she hadn't explored yet. A narrow space leading deeper into the house. The light dimmed as she stepped into it. The air cooler. Still. Her footsteps sounded softer here. Contained. She passed one closed door, then another. paused at the third. It was slightly open. Margaret pushed it gently. A bedroom, simple. A bed neatly made. A dresser. A chair by the window. Nothing out of place. Nothing excessive. She stepped inside. The floor creaked once beneath her weight. She moved to the dresser, opened the top drawer. Clothes, folded, plain, work shirts, jeans. Not new, but not worn out either. Margaret's hand hovered over them, then withdrew. She closed the drawer. Her eyes moved to the nightstand. A small object sat on it. A watch. She picked it up, turned it over. It wasn't Leonard's, not the one he wore every day. This one was older, scratched along the edges. Stopped. The hands frozen at a time that meant nothing to her. Margaret set it back down carefully. She stepped back into the hallway. The house remained silent. Watching. Holding its answers without offering them freely. Margaret returned to the main room. Her movements slower now. Heavier. She sat down again, looked at the papers, then at her own, then around the room. And something inside her shifted. Not confusion anymore. Not entirely. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Leonard had built something here, maintained it, returned to it, again and again, while she stayed behind, while she waited, while she believed she understood the shape of their life. Margaret reached for one more page, near the bottom of the stack. Different. Not a list, not a record, just a single line. A date. And beneath it, check foundation, west side holding steady. Margaret stared at it, then looked around the room again, at the walls, the floor, the structure, everything solid, everything intact, not temporary, not improvised. This house had been built to last. She sat very still. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, piece by piece, like something forming just beneath the surface. He didn't disappear from her life. He didn't vanish into something else. He divided it, carefully, completely. Two lives, running side by side, never touching. Margaret exhaled. Her hand rested flat on the table now, steady, grounded. The question from before didn't disappear. It changed, deepened. If this had always been here, then what else had she missed? Margaret didn't move for a long time. The house held its silence, not empty, not cold, just steady, like it had been waiting for her to catch up. She reached for her purse again, took out the bank statements, spread them wider across the table this time, not just the few she had brought. All of them. Every year she could carry. Her fingers moved with purpose now, not searching blindly, looking for confirmation. Dates, locations, amounts. She lined them up, matched them against the notes she had found in the house. Back and forth. Careful. Slow. Her breathing even. The first pattern had been simple. Now she saw more. The withdrawals weren't random. They followed a rhythm. Every few weeks, sometimes once a month, sometimes more often in colder seasons. Maintenance, repairs, supplies, everything in the house, explained. Margaret leaned back. Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again. Focused. There was something else, something she hadn't checked yet. She reached for a different folder, one she hadn't brought at first. The will papers. copies she had quietly slipped into her bag before leaving. She placed them on the table, carefully, flattened them out. Her fingers paused at the signature, Leonard's name, written in that tighter, strained way. She compared the date, then reached for the bank statements again. The timeline didn't sit right. 6 weeks before his death. That was when the will had been signed. Margaret remembered those weeks. Clearly. Too clearly. He had struggled to walk from the living room to the kitchen. He had forgotten conversations they'd had just hours before. He had needed help with things he once did without thinking. And yet, the will had been signed. Clean. Final. Precise. Margaret leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table. She turned the page, looked at the distribution again, the house, the business, the accounts. Everything assigned, nothing questioned, nothing explained. Her gaze shifted to the notes from the house, then back to the will, then to the bank statements. Something didn't align. Not emotionally, not logically, financially. She stood up suddenly. The chair scraped lightly behind her. Margaret moved quickly now. Back through the hallway, into the bedroom. She opened the dresser again, not looking for clothes, looking for something else. Documents, papers, anything left behind. The second drawer, empty. The third, also empty. But the bottom, her hand paused, then pulled. A single envelope, thin, unmarked. Margaret opened it. Inside, a photocopy of a property record. Her eyes moved across the page. The address. Ashvale Ridge. Her breath caught slightly. She carried it back to the table, laid it beside everything else. Compared. Dates again. Ownership records. Transfers. She read slowly, carefully, line by line. The property wasn't new. It hadn't been purchased recently. It had been held for years. Long before the will. Long before the final months. Margaret sat down again, her hands resting flat on the table. The pieces weren't scattered anymore. They were forming something. Something she could almost see. Leonard had maintained the house for decades. Quietly. Regularly. Without interruption. And yet, in the will, it didn't exist. Margaret's eyes lifted slowly. She looked around the room again, at the structure, at the care, at the evidence of time spent here, and something inside her settled into place, not an answer, but a direction. The will wasn't complete. It couldn't be, because this house, had never been part of it. Her fingers curled slightly against the wood of the table. She thought of Daniel, of the way he had spoken, confident, certain, as if everything had already been decided. But it hadn't. Not completely, not anymore. Margaret gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, aligned the edges, the way she always had. But her hands felt different now. Not careful out of habit. Careful with intention. She looked down at the key again, resting near the edge of the table. It didn't feel like a question anymore. Not entirely. It felt like a beginning. Margaret stood, walked slowly to the front door, opened it. The air outside was cooler now. Late afternoon settling in. The trees moved slightly in the wind. Soft, steady. She stepped onto the porch, looked out toward the gravel road, toward the direction she had come from. and the direction someone else might follow. Margaret's shoulders straightened, just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it. For the first time since the funeral, since the will, since the silence that followed, she didn't feel like she was being moved. She felt like she was deciding. And whatever this place was, whatever Leonard had built here, whatever he had hidden, she wasn't going to leave it unanswered. Margaret stood on the porch longer than she realized. The wind moved through the trees in slow, steady passes. Not loud, not restless, just enough to remind her that the world outside this house still existed. But something had changed. Not the house, not the road. Her. She stepped back inside and closed the door. This time the sound felt different, not like entering, like staying. The light inside had shifted toward evening. Shadows stretched longer across the floor. The air cooled slightly, settling deeper into the walls. Margaret moved through the room again, slower than before, but more certain. She gathered the papers. All of them. The handwritten notes, the property record, her bank statements, the copy of the will. Stacked them together. Organized, aligned, not out of habit, out of preparation. She placed everything neatly on the table, then sat down, her hands resting lightly on either side of the stack. Waiting. The sound came just after dusk. A car. Not passing, stopping, gravel shifting beneath tires. Margaret didn't move immediately. She listened. The engine cut off. A door opened. Closed. Footsteps, measured, confident, coming closer. Margaret stood. She didn't rush, didn't hide anything. She left the papers where they were. Walked to the door. Opened it before the knock came. Daniel stood on the porch. His expression was different now. Less certain. More controlled. Behind him, his car sat angled near the edge of the clearing, headlights off, dark against the trees. "You found it," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I did." He stepped forward slightly, as if expecting to be invited in. She didn't move, didn't step aside. They stood there, facing each other. The distance between them small, but solid. "This property belongs to the estate," Daniel said after a moment. His voice was calm, measured. But there was something underneath it. Something tighter. Margaret didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch, let him fill it if he needed to. He didn't. "It wasn't listed in the will," she said finally. Daniel's jaw shifted slightly. "That doesn't change ownership." Margaret tilted her head just a fraction. "Are you sure about that?" He exhaled slowly, stepped closer. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said. "You've already been given time. More than necessary." Margaret held his gaze. Her expression didn't change. "I've been given 2 weeks," she said. Daniel didn't answer that. Instead, his eyes moved past her, into the house, taking it in, measuring, calculating. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. Margaret's hand rested lightly against the doorframe. "I'm not alone," she said quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. "Who else is here?" Margaret didn't answer. Because the question wasn't about people. She stepped back then. Not an invitation. Indecision. "Come in," she said. Daniel hesitated, just briefly, then stepped inside. His shoes echoed faintly against the floor. He looked around slowly, taking everything in. The furniture, the coat, the boots, the table, and then the papers. His eyes settled there. Margaret watched the moment it registered. The shift, subtle, but clear. "You've been going through things," he said. Margaret closed the door behind him. "Yes." He walked toward the table, didn't touch anything yet, just stood there, looking. Margaret remained where she was, letting him come to it. "These don't mean anything," Daniel said after a moment. His voice had changed. Not as steady, not as certain. Margaret stepped forward slowly. "Don't they?" She reached past him, picked up one of the bank statements, held it between them. "Withdrawals," she said. "Regular. For years." Daniel didn't respond. She set it down, picked up the property record. "Ownership," she continued, "long before the will." His eyes flicked to it, then away. Margaret moved one step closer. Not aggressive, not forceful, just enough. "You knew about this place," she said. Daniel's gaze sharpened. "I suspected," he said. "That's not the same thing," Margaret replied. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was shifting. Daniel finally reached out, touched the edge of the table, not the papers, just the wood. Grounding himself. "You don't understand how these things work," he said. Margaret's lips pressed together briefly. "No," she said. "I understand exactly how they don't work." His eyes met hers again. And this time, there was hesitation. Real, uncovered. Margaret didn't push further, didn't need to. She stepped back, just slightly, giving him space to think, to see, to realize. "I'm not leaving," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. Daniel straightened, his posture shifting again, trying to regain control. "You don't have a choice," he said. Margaret held his gaze. "I do now." He looked at the papers again, then at her. Something in his expression tightened. Not anger, not yet, but something close to it. "We'll resolve this properly," he said. Margaret nodded once. "Yes," she said, "we will." Daniel turned toward the door, paused, then looked back at her one last time. Longer this time, as if trying to place her, as if realizing, maybe for the first time, that she wasn't who he thought she was. He left without another word. The door closed behind him. The sound settled into the house. Quiet. Final. Margaret stood where she was, listening. The car started. Gravel shifted. The sound faded slowly down the road. She exhaled. Long, steady, then turned back toward the table, toward the papers, toward everything that had been hidden. The house didn't feel the same anymore. Not just a discovery. Not just a question. Now, it was something she had to protect. Margaret stood in the quiet after Daniel left, the house settling around her like it had been waiting all along. She walked back to the table, touched the edge of the papers, then let her hand fall away. All those years, she had thought silence meant safety, that not asking questions kept things steady, that staying in place was the same as belonging. But standing there now, she could see it clearly. Leonard hadn't taken one life and lived it. He had built two. Not because he was brave enough to choose, but because he wasn't. And somehow, without meaning to, he had left her the part that was real. Not the house on Wilton Street, not the business, not the version of him people stood up and praised. This. The place he kept going back to. The place he couldn't explain. The place he never had the courage to share. Margaret stepped toward the window. The trees moved gently outside, the same steady rhythm. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was standing behind her own life. She was inside it, fully. No one speaking over her, no one deciding for her. Just her. And the quiet truth of what had always been there, waiting for her to see it. She reached into her pocket and closed her hand around the key. Not tight this time. Just enough to feel it. And she wondered, how many years can a person live beside something real before they finally turn and face it?